On November 23, 1974, thousands of onlookers crowded the streets and sidewalks of Bridgeport, Connecticut. They wanted to see with their own eyes what was real and what wasn't. They wanted to see what would later be described as the most haunted house in America. This isn't the usual ghost story. It's corroborated by over 40 hours of interviews that were conducted with police officials, firemen, paramedics, priests, and more. These witnesses were many and they were reliable. They described furniture that moved without provocation, refrigerators that hovered, and televisions that floated. They experienced unexplained noises and even physical attacks. The following is an abbreviated description of events that were recorded through the course of a scientific investigation conducted by Boyce Beatty. The abstract for this scientific paper is still on record at Duke University. In 1974, many had come to 966 Lindley Street with the hopes of seeing a poltergeist. Others left wishing only to forget. The three-room bungalow house at 966 Lindley Street was built in 1923 for a shirt manufacturer. It was a cozy 738 square feet located in a lower middle-class neighborhood near St. Vincent Hospital. Jerry and Laura Gooden would marry and purchase the home in 1960. Jerry grew up with aspirations to become a priest, but the Great Depression forced him into something more pragmatic. He became an electrician and worked for 23 years at Harvey Hubbell, a manufacturer of electrical equipment in Bridgeport. Laura grew up in a Native American home. She had no playmates her age as a child, and the isolation caused social problems for her in the future. She struggled to relate and make friends. On Halloween of 1961, they had a child, Gerard Gooden Jr. However, he was diagnosed with cerebral palsy after a few years, and despite their constant care, he died of a fever at age 6. The Goodens were devastated. They adopted a daughter less than a year later, a Native American girl named Marcia. She had suffered abuse before joining the Goodens, and raising Gerard Jr. had made them overprotective parents. Marcia struggled to make friends, and she often resorted to playing alone. She was bullied in school, and a physical attack led the Goodens to pull her from the public school system and educate her at home. Some point to the family's troubled background and traumatic losses as the cause for the activity that would soon come. Those who are most vulnerable are often the most likely to have that vulnerability exploited by the supernatural or otherwise. It began with the knocking. The Goodens made their first panicked report to the Bridgeton police in 1972. The police lieutenant later confirmed that they reported rhythmic pounding against the walls of their home. The knocking had a clear pattern, and while it began at night, it soon continued into the daylight hours. Jerry requested help from his neighbor, Officer John Holdsworth, who suggested the two make a tape recording of the noise. He thought it might help if they could produce evidence for city officials. They followed the knocking through the home between the hours of 3 and 6 a.m., and the noises seemed to span the length of the building. Over the course of weeks and months, they investigated all potential sources for the knocking. Firemen surveyed the structure and foundation of the building. Gas and plumbing lines were inspected by technicians. Law enforcement officials reviewed potential neighborhood suspects, like nearby kids or local construction crews, but all sources were quickly eliminated. The knocking continued for years, and as it became more frequent and pronounced, new phenomena began to occur. The Goodens reported seeing spectral hands and sourceless footprints around the home. They witnessed windows shatter and curtains fall. Afterward, the knocking would always worsen. However, the worst was yet to come. The events of November 23rd began after Jerry and Laura returned from the grocery store. Jerry found Marcia asleep in her room. However, the television was inexplicably face down on her bed. He returned the TV to its proper position on a nearby shelf and joined Laura in the kitchen to put away groceries. The two claimed to have witnessed dishes rattle, then levitate from the sink, circling around the kitchen before smashing into pieces. Jerry tried to investigate the sink, but knives sprang from the knife block, narrowly missing him. Shortly after, the knife block itself sheared free from the wall, screws tearing loose from their mounting. The refrigerator, weighing over 300 pounds, floated and rotated in the air. A nearby Zenith tube television toppled over, crushing 2 of Laura's toes. After cleaning up, they tried to remain in denial, blinding themselves to what had occurred. They turned out the lights in the kitchen and quietly ate dinner in the living room. Throughout the remainder of the night, the kitchen table and chairs would topple over, and Jerry would quietly straighten things again. Several other disturbances occurred that night. Curtain rods fell from almost every room, and the knocking began again. Alert and afraid, they remained awake until the early hours of the morning. The next day, over a dozen individuals would enter the home to investigate, and they would find even more inexplicable and haunting phenomena. When Jerry woke the next morning, he found the kitchen furniture in disarray. Pictures of Christ and crucifixes were torn from the wall as he navigated the home. Raw nerves and fatigue overtook Jerry and Laura. They tried to console one another, but they were disturbed by the resounding crash of a wooden bureau in Marcia's bedroom. It had just narrowly missed her. The three goons trickled into the living room, where all three recliners opened and closed, wobbling back and forth, and the TV played the sound of a doorbell. The family could no longer deny their situation. Standing in the living room, they clutched one another and fled the home, overcome with fear. They felt as if they were alone in the world, confronting the unknown. Officer John Halsworth was called back to the house by Jerry. While the family waited on the porch, afraid to re-enter the home, Officer Halsworth investigated the scene. The interior was in absolute disrepair. The kitchen furniture was overturned again. The recliners and television sets were canted away from the walls of the home. Dressers had been overturned, and religious items lay scattered about the ground. Officer Halsworth slowly moved through the room, straightening the TV absent-mindedly as he did. As soon as he passed, the TV levitated and straightened to its original spot. The recliners surrounding the officer began to open and close violently, just as they had the night before. The refrigerator loomed in the kitchen, fast approaching. He fled the home and radioed to the precinct for backup. He reported that he was certain he was witnessing something supernatural. Shortly after, Officers Carl Leonzi and Joe Tomic reported to the home around 10 a.m. The officers entered the home, and they found things in worse disorder than Officer Halsworth had encountered. After a brief investigation, the officers helped the Goodens right some of the furniture and television sets. Officer Tomic straightened a television set on the bureau, and as he let go, it began to float, then swing as if on a pendulum. A second patrol car reported to the scene with officers George Wilson and Leroy Lawson. All 5 policemen met in the kitchen of the home to brief one another. As they did, the refrigerator began to levitate again. They investigated the wall, the ceiling, and basement beneath the refrigerator, but they could determine no cause. Officer Tomic radioed for an ambulance to care for Laura's foot injury, and for the fire department to investigate the home. Nearby blasting had continued for months while the St. Vincent Hospital was building a new wing. He found it strange that Marcia was calmly watching cartoons in the living room throughout their visit. One officer fled the Gooden home as a pinned crucifix spun around its mounting nail before flying off the wall and hitting him in the chest. Later, a total of 10 firemen arrived at the scene. They immediately witnessed a TV topple off the bureau and break against the floor. Amidst all the commotion, Jerry sat in the kitchen as his friend Ted Halsworth attempted to offer help and console him. As the smell of sulfur began to creep into the home, Jerry broke down and began to cry. Surrounded by nearly 20 people, Laura Gooden seemed entirely alone. "Evil spirits are trying to kill us," she said. Another officer fled the residence claiming to have heard the pet cat speaking. He told his superior officer that he was ready to quit his job before returning to the residence. A woman from the neighborhood, Mary Pascarella, had attended a lecture on the paranormal recently. She knew poltergeist activity sometimes centered around a child, and they could be used as unconscious agents for that activity. After hearing about what had happened at 966 Lindley Street, she called notable paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. While the Warrens are known to be paranormal investigators who explored many alleged hauntings, this would be one of their most dangerous and profound investigations. At this time, a crowd started to form outside the home in response to the many parked emergency vehicles. Police set up blockades to keep the crowd at bay. The Warrens arrived with Father William Charbonneau and seminary student Paul Eno. They had no trouble finding the home as the throngs of witnesses gave the residents away. The Goodens welcomed the assistance of the Warrens as officials had yet to provide any useful information or guidance. Paul Eno was instructed to follow Marcia for the duration of the investigation. Ed Warren told Eno that children are often at the center of hoaxes, and even legitimate activity can be tarnished by a child's desire for more attention. The fire department concluded their investigation of the foundation, cellar support, and floor joists. Another team had visited the nearby construction site at St. Vincent's Hospital. Both teams determined there was no clear cause. Around 2 p.m., the police officers wrapped their investigation and began to leave the home. Officer Tomek retreated to Marcia's room to attempt an experiment. He later recounted that he stood in her room and thought, "If you can hear me, move something." He witnessed pictures, crosses, and decorative cherubs spring to life from their mountings. They drove him from the room. He later recounted that he would avoid including this in his police report as he was afraid it would ruin his career. Reporters from local TV stations and the local WNAB radio station arrived at the scene, and their story would be picked up by the Associated Press and circulated nationally. The Goodens became a household name. Reporters were admitted to the home, and one misidentified a Bible as a book of the occult. Soon, the press began to speculate that Marcia had connections to Magica. Speculation began that Marcia had perpetrated the paranormal events herself. Some believed that she was the obsession of a demonic entity, and others that she was at the center of an elaborate hoax. Lorraine Warren investigated Marcia's room and became overwhelmed with nausea. She reported her experience to Ed, who witnessed a second-degree burn slowly forming on her wrist. He advised her to leave the home before something worse happened. Even as she reassured him, her wound began to blister. The smell of sulfur began to creep through the home, emanating from Marcia's room. It wasn't until the next day that the Goodens would see the poltergeist for the first time. The police department left 4 patrol cars and 8 officers at the Gooden home. They were a protective detail against a crowd that was quickly becoming unruly. Laura Gooden phoned Father Charbonneau, frantic and fearful. The Goodens had concluded that whatever was in their home was demonic in nature. They wanted an exorcism to purify their home, but the church had investigated and found no supernatural cause. Likely, they did not want to get involved in a case that had become so heavily publicized. That day, a heavy cold settled over the kitchen, and the overhead lights began to flicker. A cloud of yellow mist settled, and the outlines of 4 figures could be seen within. Jerry described this as the moment he was overtaken. He began to unconsciously recite the Mass of the Dead in Latin. He circled through the home slowly, his voice baritone and not his own, as he sprinkled the priest's holy water into each room. The figures in the mist followed him as he moved through the home. Paul Eno, the seminary student who had arrived with the Warrens, suspected that the figures were feeding off the terror of the family and witnesses. He felt a sense of rage emanating from the mist. He pushed through the fog to grab Jerry, and he felt a physical presence to one of the figures. He later described this feeling as that of a bony structure, reedy and bird-like. With Jerry in hand, he drove everyone outside to the front lawn, and the crowd began to murmur as they emerged. The Warrens and Father Charbonneau later entered the home to conduct a house blessing. They began by sprinkling holy water in the 4 corners of the basement. In the poor light, the father saw a shadowy figure emerge from the wall and approach him. He called out, and the Warrens saw the same figure. To Ed Warren, this was confirmation of the demonic presence in the home. One policeman, Officer Del Toro, claimed that Marcia had confessed to him that she was responsible for the events of the last few days. He relayed this information to detectives and journalists, even though he couldn't explain how she would have made the television and refrigerator levitate, let alone how she deceived so many trained investigators. However, speculation began to spread that the Goodens, the Warrens, or both were perpetrating a hoax. These rumors drove the Goodens to refuse contact with the Warrens. They were ready to accept that Marcia had been the source for the mayhem. They were relieved to have an answer, any answer, even if it didn't fit all the evidence. A psychiatric professional was called to the home to evaluate Marcia's mental health. It was determined that she needed outpatient care, and she was taken to a mental health clinic. She would be discharged at a later date, cleared with no issues. The Bridgeport police superintendent announced that the case would be closed as a hoax. He had motivation to close the case at any cost, as the around-the-clock protective duties and ongoing investigations were eating into budgets. The nation was watching his town descend into chaos as crowds poured into the street to hear his officers talk about paranormal activity. Everything has a rational explanation. This is the work of human powers. I don't believe in that supernatural stuff. There are no ghosts in Bridgeport. They were victims of the power of suggestion. Even some of my own men were taken in, the superintendent said. Despite the dozens of witnesses, police records, and unexplainable phenomena, the case of the Lindley poltergeist was eventually forgotten. However, many questions still remain unanswered about what really happened at 966 Lindley Street. To this day, the home still stands. Perhaps something remains hidden within, only waiting to reveal the answers.